Morning, everybody. Sorry for the late post. I mistakenly believed this was due Wednesday. I don't know what I was thinking. We got too much going on, I think. So we'll get right to it. We'll talk about police legitimacy today. Got a couple articles to talk about. The first study was We Never Call the Cops, and here is why. They focused on 3 neighborhoods in the Philadelphia area, renamed all 3 of them, obviously to protect the identities. Each respondent was offered a $25 payment in return for their participation in the study. They focused on one primarily African-American neighborhood, one primarily Latino, and one white. Renamed all these Cedar Grove, the Barrio, and Plymouth. The goals of this were to determine how these kids felt about police in their town, how they felt about the response, how they felt they were taken care of, how they felt they were treated. They used interviews to accomplish this, to try to get a deeper look into these perceived problems, these preferences these kids had about the police and their involvement with the police. They focused on youth because this is a demographic that's often excluded heavily from most studies. You're normally looking at the studies that are either profitable or sensational, looking at murders, things that catch headlines. Nobody ever really bothers to ask for the opinion of the youth. So the sampling was about 146 kids. They attempted to make it pretty even amongst male and female. Did a pretty good job at that. Age range started at 12 and went all the way to 23. The bulk of that was in the middle, around the 14 and 19-year-old. What was striking to me was that 61% of these people had never been arrested before. So this is more of a vicarious opinion of law enforcement, I think, or maybe the things that they see around them. Another important thing to note is that over half of them had lived in these neighborhoods for a long period of time. They're not transplants or just showing up on the scene. They've been there and experienced most of the things they're being asked about. Another striking thing about this study was the huge homicide rate in some of these towns. I mean, it's you can tell by the bar graph that it's pretty significant. This is over 10 times in the Barrio they were experiencing what the Philadelphia as a whole was experiencing. You can tell that poverty is obviously a big factor here. The violent crime rate, that's what really stood out to me. Is you're looking at almost 12,000 per 100,000 in the Barrio, as opposed to about I think it was 12 to 1,400 in Philadelphia as a whole, and that goes down as you move towards the wider neighborhoods, which seems to be a common trend in these areas. So 223 times during these interviews, these kids mentioned a specific attitude that they felt or an opinion they had toward the police. Not very many of them, but more than you would think, were generally positive. 26% is not a very small number. Almost 12% had mixed feelings. These people responded that they knew there was a difference between good and bad cops and just didn't really have a specific opinion. But overwhelmingly, I mean, almost over 60% were negative. Almost 20% of these had a negative interaction, and 15% thought that the police were outright ineffective. So they were also asked what they would do to change things, what they would do to improve the situation with the police in their towns. Most of them actually advocated for more police or methods to improve the police presence as it was. What was pretty strange to see was that most of the negative comment folks were really huge proponents for more police. They stated they wanted more cops on the block. There was one that stated if you have a police on every corner, there's not really much you can do. Everything's on lockdown. Most of them advocated for increased penalties and more certain, it's the certainty of the punishment that deters the crime kind of thing. A few others thought that more jobs and community involvement would fix the problem, and a good solid 10-11% thought that there wasn't anything they could do. It was just going to be that way. It's always been that way, and it will always be that way. Oops, sorry. So the study concludes that even though there's a significant portion of negative opinions amongst the youth, that there's still hope. There's still desire in these kids to effect some sort of positive change, and that living in a situation that's a little more fair, a little more equitable, is the ultimate goal. So the next study, they took a little cute stylistic preference on that injustice with the parentheses there, sought to bring a better light onto the perception of the justice system as a whole and whether it was fair or not. This also used some kids from Philadelphia, but also a good portion of the sample was from Phoenix. So the study was looking to find out if procedural justice, the perception of it, meaning whether it was fair or not, changes over time, or was something that was already established in the minds, or was altered by experiences of personal arrest, or by seeing family and friends arrested, or was it merely something that just changed as you grew up? So over 1,300 kids from 14 to 18, with an average of 16 years old, predominantly male, 41% black, 34% Hispanic, and each of these had an average of a little over 3 police encounters prior to being involved in the study. So there's obviously some predisposition here. So these interviews, this was also a qualitative study, interviews were conducted within 30 days of the first arrest or conviction or experience with the system. After that, interviews were conducted every 6 months for a period of 3 years. And after that, interviews were conducted once a year. That came out to a total of 7 years worth of data. And if somebody completed the study 100%, that was 11 possible interviews that they could have had. Over 80, or about 80% had 10 or more of these, so it was a pretty good response rate. The interviews were self-reported. They used a Likert scale, so kind of like job interviews today. How do you feel about this on a scale of 1 to 5? Asked questions about how they felt they were treated or how they saw others treated while dealing with the justice system. So one of the measures was a lagged procedural justice. This was anything they had experienced beforehand, leading up to the study. They moved on to talk about personal arrests. How many times had this person been arrested themselves? And vicarious arrests was another consideration. So they asked if a family member or a friend, peer group member had been arrested and what that experience was like for them. Total arrests, all these put together, age, of course, and then time as a factor, how long they'd spent in the justice system, how long had passed since the last interaction. This was another, not surprising, but a little interesting set of results. These, of course, opinions do change over time. Everybody experiences that, but there wasn't necessarily a tendency to view the police or the justice system in a more negative light as time went on. Even with more arrests, it's almost as if the subjects were becoming accustomed. They knew what they had gotten into, maybe resigned to that life, and they had just come to expect things. Also, worthy of note is that higher instances of vicarious arrests, so if family members or friends were getting arrested, mostly family members were getting arrested at a higher rate, that resulted in a more negative opinion. So we can probably attribute this to, you get protective about your family members and your friends and you want to take up for them. But what we can't ignore is that all of these results, and in any study we do, is going to be individualistic, highly individualistic in nature. There's nuance, there's perspective, there's context that must be accounted for. We can't just take numbers for what they are. You have to be able to read behind the numbers and read between the lines to figure out what's going on in these communities. I hope that was a good summation for you guys.